Hello everyone. In October 1815, a ship brought Napoleon to the island of St. Helena, a remote island in the southern Atlantic, more than 1,000 miles away from the coast of Africa. This was the end of the road for a fallen emperor. It would be there, in the company of a small group of followers, and closely watched by the British governor of the island, that he would spend the last 6 years of his life in boredom and craving the arrival of the few newspapers that reached the island. This time, everything had been done to ensure he wouldn't escape, like he had done in his first exile a year earlier. Far away, in Europe, the continent was recovering from 2 decades of wars. A new order was forming, and the shadow of Napoleon was slowly dissipating. He was no longer a concern for politicians or for military commanders. He now belonged to historians, writers, or poets like Lord Byron, who saw him as the ultimate romantic hero, the man whose destiny had been bigger than life, a flawed genius that was now ending his life lonely and persecuted. But what had happened in these past 15 years? In the first part of the story, we saw how Napoleon had risen to power, covered himself in glory in the wars of the French Revolution, and ended up at the center of a coup in 1799 that made him the prominent ruler of revolutionary France. We have also seen how France had reversed its position from an almost desperate situation in 1792 and 93 to a victorious one in its war against other continental powers, a conflict called War of the First Coalition that had ended in advantageous peace treaties, leaving only Great Britain at war with France. Tonight, in this second part, we are going to explore the events from 1799 to 1807, with some of Napoleon's most brilliant victories, like the Battle of Austerlitz, and also setbacks or strategic dead ends, like the Battle of Trafalgar. And we will also talk about the repercussions of these European events around the world, like with the Louisiana Purchase or the independence of Haiti in the Caribbean. And in the third and last part, I will tell you about the last coalitions, the last wars of Napoleon, the campaign of Russia, and the subsequent collapse of Napoleon's ambitions that finally ended at the Battle of Waterloo. There's a lot to tell, so please get ready for it. You can sit or lie down comfortably and take a few seconds to release the tension in your shoulders. All you need to do is listen and let me do the work. If you fall asleep, there are timestamps in the comment pinned under this video to help you resume the story later. And as usual, you will find links to streaming platforms where you can also listen to my stories, or my Patreon page in the same comment. Now, take a deep breath. We have a long ride ahead with politics, battles, diplomacy, many twists and turns and grand strategy. Let's begin. When we ended the first part, General Bonaparte had just seized power in a coup of which he was just supposed to be a part of, a member of the group of plotters. But the turn of events and his control over the troops involved in the coup gave him preeminence. So he hastily drafted a new constitution in a few weeks that was submitted to a referendum at the beginning of 1800, adopted, and this created a system called the consulate, in which a council of 3 consuls was at the head of the government. But Bonaparte was first consul, and the 2 others had very limited powers. In practice, the first consul held all actual power, and this system was just another name for a dictatorship. Officially, France remained a republic, but in reality the phase of democracy, however imperfect it had been, was now over. Some of the appearances would be preserved, like calling referendums or having elected assemblies, but only with a consultative role. So as you see, in just 10 years, the French Revolution had very different regimes. There were like several revolutions within the revolution. It became a constitutional monarchy at the beginning, then a radical republic that granted universal suffrage for the first time. Everybody could vote, at least men. Then the Directory that I told you about in the first part, that was a kind of oligarchic republic. And finally an autocratic republic. In these last regimes, the universal right to vote was withdrawn, and vote became selective. Only people paying taxes, implying that they had an estate and high income, were granted the right to vote. Obviously, this sounds shocking and anti-democratic nowadays, but the logic was that the right to vote should be limited to responsible citizens who contributed to the functioning of the state through their taxes. The others could still enjoy almost the same rights: economic freedom, freedom of movement or of conscience, but not the right to choose the government. Of course, such a system could only elect conservative governments that cared for order, stability, and the protection of private property, which was exactly the intention of their creators. But actually, the principle of one man equals one vote was still seen as almost utopian and certainly very dangerous for stability in the late 18th century. Even nations that had advanced towards democracy, like the United States or the United Kingdom, did not apply it. There were property or wealth requirements to vote, or slavery existed which denied that right to some. And it is only progressively along the 19th and 20th centuries that the right to vote was extended to all male citizens, regardless of their wealth, and later to women. The the first experience ever of universal suffrage in a large country was this short period starting in 1793, the First French Republic, and that didn't last long, but that was extremely radical at the time. So by taking power with this new constitution, did Napoleon put an end to the French Revolution? Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that he ended the attempts at democracy and he was a dictator. So he made the regime drift back towards autocracy, like before the revolution. But his new regime also acknowledged and protected many of the changes that had occurred in the 1790s and that would later spread to the rest of the Western world, like the elimination of birthrights, the elimination of all guilds and regulation that limited the access to certain professions or occupations to certain people, the protection of private property from interference by the state, freedom of conscience too. Many of these aspects were already present in the United States at the time, but the USA in 1800 were quite far from Europe, and they were still a fairly small country. They had 5 to 6 million inhabitants. For comparison, that was the population of Ireland at the time. France had 30 million inhabitants, and it was the second most populated country in Europe, just after Russia, with 35 to 40 million. This large population would be one of the bases of Napoleon's might that would be deployed in the following decade. Russia was also a country with a large population, and it would turn out to be a dangerous foe. But at the time, Russia was still lagging Western Europe in terms of technology and equipment, and its population was scattered on a very large area. The main neighbors of France, the participants in the First Coalition, were lagging demographically and couldn't field armies that big. Austria had a bit more than 20 million subjects. Prussia, Spain, or Great Britain, the island, not the entire United Kingdom, had about 10 million. And Napoleon's grip on France remained very firm, at least for the first 12 years of his reign as First Consul and later as Emperor. I tell you about that in a few minutes. He was very popular for most of this time. There was a period of hesitation in the month following his coup, but rather quickly he strengthened his grip on power and became well accepted. In the referendum of 1800, to vote on the new constitution and make him First Consul, there were 3 million electors. Not much in a country of 30 million, but women could not vote, and remember that the electorate was selected based on wealth. He won by officially 99.9%. These results look a bit too good to be true, and indeed the participation numbers and rate of approval were rigged to make them look better. But he still was supported by the vast majority of asset owners in the country, big and small, for the stability and preservation of their rights that he embodied. But his popularity went far beyond the rich. In cities or in the countryside, he benefited from his prestige as a victorious general. He was a guarantee of peace. internally and externally, after 10 exhausting years. At least this is how he sold himself, because the following years were obviously not peaceful at all. And he also had an intuition that served him well politically. The rise of nationalism or patriotism. This sense of belonging to a nation, a community with a common history and a common destiny. This was not entirely new. It had been growing slowly along the 18th century. People developed a sense of belonging to their countries as opposed to just being the subjects of the same sovereign. In the American Revolution, 20 years earlier, the idea of nation was clearly present, and from the start the French Revolution referred to it. But that was still a very fresh concept, and one that had been reinforced along the first 10 years of the French Revolution, because the country had been able to overcome the adversity of falling into a civil war and being invaded at the same time, even becoming victorious and expanding in the process. Napoleon found a great tool in this, to position himself as the champion of a nation, its guide and its protector. This is a bit ironic, given that he had become French by accident, being born in Corsica, and his sense of patriotism was non-existent until it became advantageous for him to become a patriot. I told you about aspects of his personality and opportunism in the first part, but that was also a brilliant political intuition and one of his legacies. Political leaders and heads of state turned increasingly into national champions along the 19th century, for better or worse. This grip on the country he immediately needed, because just a few months after the end of the First Coalition, that had seen all European countries except Great Britain sign peace, war had already resumed, and a second coalition had appeared. The main participants to the First Coalition against revolutionary France had been Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, Spain, kingdoms in Italy, and the Dutch Republic. It had ended with France annexing the Austrian Netherlands, that is to say, modern Belgium, and creating satellite states in the north of Italy and the Netherlands. But these peace treaties were more like ceasefires. They had not sorted out conflicts. The Austrians had been imposed very harsh peace conditions that they didn't intend to comply with. The Ottomans had been attacked too, attacked by France in the campaign of Egypt. And on the other side of Europe, another kingdom, Russia, was increasingly preoccupied of French expansionism and of the risk to traditional regimes and societies that this revolution had created. All these countries entered in mutual alliances against France and its satellites, and against France's new ally, Spain, which had reverted its alliances and was now willing to fight alongside France for various reasons, including not having an enemy on its frontier that it could not defend against, but also because of its rivalry with Great Britain in America, and the need to preserve its colonies around the world, which at the time were larger than ever, including half of the Americas from the American West Coast to the very south of South America. In 1799, Before Napoleon even became first consul, hostilities had already resumed, and this time the main opponents of France were Austria, Great Britain, Russia, the Kingdom of Naples in the south of Italy, Portugal, and the Ottoman Empire. The Allies began attacks on two main fronts, in Italy and Switzerland, and in the Netherlands. These attacks had mixed results. In the Netherlands, there was an Anglo-Russian force that was repelled and had to retreat. In Switzerland, it was worse. A Russian army started with initial victories, but then the army was completely routed at a battle near Zurich. In Italy, the Allies were more successful. The French were repelled to the Alps, the traditional frontier between France and Italy. But Russia quickly grew irritated with its allies. Its leader, Paul I, the Tsar, was faced with strong internal opposition, and indeed he would be killed or dethroned in 1801. So after a few months, Russia left the coalition and stayed out of the war for several years. That was the first setback for this second coalition, and things only went downhill from there. Napoleon, who was now in power in 1800, sent one of his best generals, Moreau, to campaign in Germany against Austria and its German allies. And at the same time he raised another army for himself that would march on Italy. The French counterattack won on all fronts. In Germany, Moreau invaded Bavaria and won a major battle, the Battle of Hohenlinden. Napoleon marched through Switzerland and he attacked the Austrians in the north of Italy. He defeated them, but narrowly, at the Battle of Marengo. For propaganda purposes, the story of this battle was rewritten to strengthen Napoleon's power. It was only 7 months after his coup, so the battle was spinned as a brilliant victory. And it was a success indeed, but not the kind of triumph that would be sold to the public. By 1801, the Second Coalition collapsed. Austria had been defeated again, Russia was gone, Prussia was not willing to enter a conflict on the side of a coalition that was now falling apart, and Spain and France had invaded Portugal. So once again, only the United Kingdom remained at war. But it had been at war with France for almost 10 years. The public opinion was turning against this permanent state of war. It was very expensive, and public debt was quickly mounting. Trade was disrupted, and the pro-war Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger, fell to his political opponents. All of this decided the British to sign a peace in 1802, the Treaty of Amiens, a city in the north of France. So for the first time in 10 years, peace was back, but it wouldn't last. Napoleon's campaigns on the continent had remained victorious, but there were setbacks overseas. We saw in part 1 how the campaign of Egypt ended in failure, militarily and politically. In 1801, Napoleon sent another expedition, led by his brother-in-law, this time to the Caribbean, to the island of Saint-Domingue. Why? Along the 18th century, the most lucrative colonies for European countries were located in the Caribbean. They produced colonial goods like sugar, cotton, dyes, or coffee. And for the Kingdom of France, the most developed and strategic of these colonies were the island of Martinique and the colony of Saint-Domingue on an island, Hispaniola, that was shared with Spain. The western part, which nowadays corresponds to Haiti, was French, and the eastern part, present-day Dominican Republic, was Spanish. After the beginning of the Revolution, upheavals took place in the colony, especially a massive slave revolt that led to the abolition of slavery in 1793 in Saint-Domingue, a decision that the National Assembly in Paris endorsed and spread to all its colonies. In fact, it was never really applied, and the decision was later reversed. Real abolition would wait several more decades. But there were many more black slaves than European-born colonists or their descendants in Saint-Domingue, and the slave revolt forced the central power in Paris to recognize their leader, a former slave called Toussaint Louverture, as the governor of the colony. Louverture fought off attempts to capture the colony by the Spanish in the eastern part and the British who tried landings. But after several years of autonomy in a colony where former slaves were now free, Louverture began to strain ties with France. He sent expeditions to the Spanish side, even though peace had been signed with Spain. And in 1801, he promulgated a constitution that made the colony self-ruled, and he declared himself governor for life. For the second time, after the 13 colonies that formed the United States, an European colony declared its independence in the Americas. These events happened during the wars of the First and the Second Coalitions, during which France couldn't really divert its attention from Europe. But by the end of 1801, things had changed. The Second Coalition was falling apart. Peace negotiations with the UK were underway, and the colonial lobby that represented wealthy plantation owners was trying to obtain help from the government to retake Saint-Domingue or be compensated. Almost all European colonists had left the colony at this point and relocated elsewhere in the Caribbean or in Louisiana, especially around New Orleans. Some of them recreated plantations there on the same model. In the 1790s, the relationship between Toussaint Louverture and Paris was relatively cordial. He even sent his two sons to be educated in Paris. But when he proclaimed independence and declared himself governor for life of the ex-colony in 1801, Napoleon decided to act and send an expedition to retake the colony, re-establish French rule, and compensate the planters. The colony was retaken with an expeditionary force in a very deadly campaign, but even though Toussaint was arrested and his supporters disarmed, the colony proved uncontrollable. Tropical diseases like yellow fever ravaged the army. Defections multiplied, and a new uprising in 1802 overwhelmed what remained of the French Expeditionary Corps. In 1804, after a reconquest, The former colony was proclaimed to be the second independent state in the Americas after the United States, under the name of Haiti. But Haiti would not be so successful. Just 2 years after its creation, the new state was plunged into a civil war, and it kept struggling for decades to restore its economy and pacify itself. The abandonment of Saint-Domingue, which was the most prosperous French colony of the 18th century, meant that Napoleon lost interest in colonial matters in America, and it contributed to the decision to sell Louisiana to the United States in 1803. When this happened, this sale of Louisiana was a big deal. It instantly doubled the size of the United States. The price paid was relatively modest, $15 million. Obviously, it was worth much more than $15 million of today. It reflected the absence of developed cities, except New Orleans, and the lack of interest of Napoleon for a territory that could not be well defended, and that the United States would have probably taken one way or the other at some point. But in Europe, things looked much better for Napoleon. His popularity soared after victory against the Second Coalition and the Treaty of Amiens with the UK. He had delivered on his promise to bring back peace in advantageous terms. And because he never forgot to turn favorable circumstances into new advantages, he asked to become consul for life instead of having a limitation of 10 years to his mandate. The electorate was happy to oblige, and this was approved in a new referendum, another step towards autocratic power. But that was still not enough, and for some time another project had developed in Napoleon's head. Change regime again, and turn the consulate into an imperial system based on the Roman model. Like power in the ancient Roman Republic had turned increasingly personalized, leading to its replacement with an empire ruled by hereditary sovereigns. He would do the same with France, that had expanded its frontiers and was now surrounded by several client states. The circumstances were favorable. His popularity was at its highest point ever, and there had been several assassination attempts against him by royalists or left-wing Democrats, all uncovered and stopped by his police. Apart from attracting sympathy on him, these plots could justify the creation of a new dynastic system in which rulers have heirs that can immediately replace them and guarantee the continuity of the state and of the regime. So in 1804, a new referendum was held and massively approved the transformation of the French Republic, or what remained of this facade, into the French Empire, with Emperor Napoleon I at its head. In practice, this new regime continued the kind of dictatorship that the consulate had put in place, and beyond the revamp of titles and institutions, its bases were the same: preserve a strong government that guaranteed order, a number of civil liberties, economic freedom and property. The old aristocracy and the Catholic Church, whose properties had been confiscated and sold to the new elite had to be barred from returning to claim what they had lost. The transformation of the social and economic system had been very fast and radical in France, but it was just an advanced signal of a broader phenomenon that took place all across Europe in the 19th century, and of which the US independence is also an aspect. The shift in power from the old aristocracy or religious authorities to a new emerging class, the bourgeoisie, either through revolutions, revolts, or incremental transformations over time. The old characteristics of the aristocracy, with legal privileges based on birth, all of this disappeared across the West in a century, and the meaning of the term privilege changed from a set of legal advantages to economic or relation-based advantages that some people receive because of the environment in which they are born. Napoleon actually recreated a nobility. He named new nobles that were granted titles, but this imperial aristocracy was more honorific than anything. The titles came without land. They didn't give other rights. And actually within the French aristocracy, which has not disappeared today, even though they just own titles and have a tradition, sometimes an estate inherited from their family history, but apart from that they are citizens like anyone else. A distinction is still being made between nobles of the Ancien Régime, from the times of monarchy prior to the Revolution, and nobles of the Empire. To the most snobs of the former, imperial nobility is still a bit too recent and of dubious extraction to be considered their equals. Another symbolic thing that reflected how times had changed is that Napoleon didn't become Emperor of France, he was Emperor of the French, implying that he was on the throne by the will of the people and not due to a God-given right. Obviously that's more semantics than anything concrete, because the people would never be asked again if it was still their will. But it shows how the political, social, symbolic order of things had shifted since the Revolution. And Napoleon was going to need all the resources of his new empire, because a third coalition was already on the horizon in 1804. Peace with the United Kingdom didn't last. The peace treaty was signed in 1802, but in May 1803, the UK declared war again. Why? Because Napoleon was taking advantage of the peace to make more gains, and because on the other side, the British government considered it couldn't let him satisfy his apparently never-ending appetite. In Italy, you remember Napoleon had created sister republics in the north after his invasion during the War of the First Coalition. He annexed the region of Piedmont, one of the wealthiest regions of Italy. In Switzerland, he intervened to put in place a friendly regime. Switzerland had been overrun by French armies and renamed the Helvetic Republic, a centralized state based on the ideas of the French Revolution in 1798. But the country was unstable and had turned into a battlefield with French, Austrian, and Russian armies ravaging it in the War of the Second Coalition. Napoleon intervened to recreate a confederation, the Swiss Confederation, that was independent, but due to its proximity to France and Napoleon's influence, it had in fact fallen into the French sphere of influence. These actions did not violate the terms of peace with Great Britain, but they inflamed tensions as the government in London realized that by leaving Napoleon alone, they were enabling him to keep expanding. The Royal Navy was still far superior to the French fleet, but France was allied with Spain, and the British remembered that there had been times in the 17th and 18th centuries when the French fleet had been a threat, like at the time of the American War of Independence. Giving Napoleon the time to build the fleet, now that he also controlled the Netherlands, yet another maritime power, this was a huge risk. So the UK refused to apply some of the terms of the Treaty of Amiens, like the evacuation of Malta in the Mediterranean Sea, and instead it decided to return to war. They needed allies, and in 1803 and 04, their diplomacy worked on the creation of a third coalition that they offered to support financially. After the harsh peace conditions imposed on the vanquished, especially on Austria, and the ongoing expansionism of France, they found an interested audience across Europe. At the end of 1804, Sweden joined the UK, and in 1805, Russia, which had a new Tsar, Alexander I. Austria had reorganized after its defeat of 1801 and rejoined a few months later, taking its allies from Germany, from the Holy Roman Empire, into the conflict. The Holy Roman Empire that I have sometimes referred to was not a state, it was a loose confederation inherited from the Middle Ages, made of dozens of small states, kingdoms, principalities, duchies, free cities, that covered initially all of Germany, the Low Countries, and the north of Italy. It lost territory along the centuries and ended up being centered on Germany, but for a long time it had been under the influence, under the lead of the Habsburgs, the rulers of Austria and Hungary. The Habsburgs didn't have full control over the various states of the Holy Roman Empire, but it was one of the sources of their power and influence in Europe through their active diplomacy and their alliances with some of the states of the Holy Roman Empire. The War of the Third Coalition lasted 3 years, and it ended in disaster for some of its members, helping Napoleon to project his power far beyond the frontiers of France and begin to remodel Europe to his liking. For the first 18 months, it was only against the United Kingdom, and Napoleon organized the gathering of a large army, 200,000 men, near the city of Boulogne on the French coast, where the crossing to Great Britain could take only a few hours. But between his army and the other side of the channel was the Royal Navy. Everyone was aware of this, and the plan that emerged was to try and attract a part of the Royal Navy away by sending, for example, an expedition to the Caribbean, and then a combined French and Spanish fleet would secure the channel, even for a short period of time, for a quick crossing to England. And once in England, Napoleon had little doubt that he would be able to invade the entire island. On the British side, this possible invasion was a source of concern. Fortifications were built along the coast, and militias were raised. But the French had none of the ships necessary to carry these troops. The bulk of French naval forces, the ships of the line, were split into a fleet of the Atlantic in Brest, in Brittany, and a Mediterranean fleet in Toulon. Both ports were blockaded by superior forces. So Napoleon's plan or hope was that the Mediterranean fleet would be able to break the blockade nevertheless, then sail to the Caribbean, where it would form a single large fleet with Spanish ships. They would somehow lose the Royal Navy in the Atlantic on their return to Europe, join forces with the French Atlantic Fleet, and then force the channel and secure it long enough for the army to cross to the other side. Napoleon successfully executed this kind of audacious moves with the element of surprise on land several times, but on the seas, with all the unforeseeable elements like the winds and the hypothetical ability to escape larger enemy fleets, this didn't look that realistic. And indeed, the plan was called off, not just because it was unconvincing, but also because the Third Coalition was gathering, and a new large land conflict in continental Europe was approaching, which the members of the coalition couldn't hide given the scale of their preparations. Shortly after the plan for the invasion of Great Britain had been postponed in 1805, on top of this, the Battle of Trafalgar happened, in which the main British fleet, commanded by Admiral Nelson, destroyed a large part of the Spanish and French fleet. The French Mediterranean fleet at Toulon was under blockade, but in the hope of attracting it outside the port and force a battle, Nelson maintained a loose blockade. He hoped that the French would try to move away from the protection of coastal artillery to attack the few visible ships, and then he would be able to engage his main force against them. But this plan backfired. The Toulon fleet sailed out for a journey to the port of Cadiz in the south of Spain, where it was supposed to join the Spanish and execute the plan by sailing to the Caribbean. Due to the loose blockade and bad luck, there were storms. Nelson couldn't intercept it, and the fleet escaped, reaching Cadiz in a few days. Then they sailed to the Caribbean. Nelson pursued it, and the battle took place against the joint fleets off the coast of Spain several weeks later, after the crossing of the Atlantic and the journey back to Europe. On paper, the two fleets were of similar size and similar firepower, but British ships were more modern, better commanded, and better coordinated. Nelson knew it, and he tried an audacious maneuver to cut the line of enemy ships, starting the battle very differently from the usual tactics employed in naval battles. This proved very efficient. Most of this combined Franco-Spanish fleet was sunk or captured, enough to guarantee naval supremacy to the Royal Navy for the foreseeable future. And actually, this supremacy would not be challenged again until the end of Napoleonic Wars. So the Battle of Trafalgar did not actually stop the plan to invade Great Britain, because it had already been called off, but it postponed it indefinitely, and it was still a major strategic success because it eliminated the risk of an invasion for several years at least. Trafalgar took place in October 1805, and it was a success for the coalition, but an isolated one, because on land, the invasion plans were once again turning into a disaster for the Allies. 2 months before Trafalgar, the troops stationed along the English Channel had been diverted to the east to attack through Germany, where the combined armies of Austria, Russia, German states, and possibly Sweden were expected to gather. Napoleon's army had been grown to 350,000 men at this point, by far the largest single army Europe had ever seen. Soon it would be called the Grande Armée, the Great Army. It had received a lot of training and state-of-the-art equipment, which contrasted with other large foreign armies that had to be mobilized hastily and were much less professional in the years 1805-1806. This army would form the backbone of Napoleon's campaigns and victories in the following years. And on land, the Third Coalition suffered a series of disasters. It started for the Austrians at the Battle of Ulm in southern Germany. 200,000 French soldiers had crossed the Rhine to march on Germany in various directions. The Austrians had concentrated their main army, 60,000 men, at the fortress of Ulm. Thanks to Napoleon's army rapid marching, Austrian troops were outflanked and encircled at Ulm, cutting off 60,000 men that had to surrender against only 2,000 French casualties. Even before the Russians had arrived, the Austrians had already lost the bulk of their forces, and continuing eastward, Napoleon reached and captured Vienna. What followed is probably his most famous battle, Austerlitz. Francis II, the ruler of Austria and Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, had been joined near Vienna by the Russian army and Alexander I, the new young Tsar. Napoleon needed another decisive battle to leave the two countries with no other option than sign peace at his conditions. But he couldn't force them to engage in battle, so he tricked them. As he was still near Vienna, he gave every indication that the French army was in a poor state. He ordered some of his forces to simulate a retreat north of Vienna, and he even abandoned the best defensive position in the area, a plateau called Pratzen Heights, near the village of Austerlitz. The two other emperors decided to engage him with a combined Austro-Russian army. Francis II, because he was desperate to retake his capital, and Alexander I, because he had not brought an army from so far to just sit and wait. So they advanced and took position on Pratzen Heights, which looked like a safe move, since it was easy to defend, and the French army was probably exhausted anyway, or so they thought. The battle took place in December. Napoleon presented an army that looked weak on its right flank. The obvious move for the Austro-Russians was therefore to attack on this side, so that they would be able to disband part of Napoleon's army and attack it from two sides. But this was a trap. Napoleon knew that reinforcement was coming from Vienna and would plug the gap just in time, preventing this segment of the battle line to collapse. And as the Allies were slowly deploying their attack, weakening the defenses of Pratzen Heights, he launched a massive assault on it, retaking the plateau and cutting the Allies in two parts. The Austrian and Russian line was collapsing, which in a battle of this era was a disaster for an army, because it exposed its logistics, its artillery, and its ability to maneuver and defend its flanks. The Allies began to disband chaotically, allowing the French to take thousands of prisoners and to destroy the main force of the Third Coalition. Austria sued for peace again and was presented with a peace treaty that confirmed the territorial losses of its previous treaties with France, adding only a financial indemnity. This was relatively generous in Napoleonic terms because neither Russia nor Great Britain had agreed to peace yet. The Third Coalition was gone since only two major countries remained at war with France in 1806, but more would join soon. And they would join because Napoleon's appetite still raged on. Following the knockout of Austria, he created another state in Germany, intended to serve as an ally and a buffer state between France and Central Europe, the Confederation of the Rhine, which was a collection of German states put together in the same confederation. This meant that the Holy Roman Empire had effectively ceased to exist after a millennium. There will be more of this, but this is an illustration of Napoleon's policy and difficulty to create the conditions of a lasting peace. If he ever wanted peace, he was at least clumsy, because he systematically created conditions that were unacceptable for other powers. A line of defense of his propaganda and his supporters, including after his exile, was that he only defended France from attacks. And technically it may look like it. There was peace in 1802, and hostilities resumed in 1803 with a British declaration of war, after which France received multiple declarations of war until the end. But this ignores the extremely harsh peace conditions imposed by Napoleon, or it fails to explain how a defensive war that starts near the Rhine River ends up in Moscow 8 years later, thousands of miles to the east. So, as in every war, there may be a debate about shared responsibilities, but it cannot ignore that Napoleon acted as a bully, as a threat, way more than the Allies. And this is also why, from this point on, after the Third Coalition, many historians considered that these wars were no longer a country defending itself or its regime. They had become the wars of a man using a country and other states he had taken control of to pursue his dreams of domination. In a context like this, it was not surprising that old enemies would reappear. For the moment, in 1806, it would be Prussia, which was worried that the Confederation of the Rhine created by Napoleon, was a direct attack on its influence in Germany, which it was. With the re-entry of Prussia into the conflict, this phase is known as the Fourth Coalition, but in fact it is mainly the continuation of the Third Coalition. Other belligerents like Russia, Great Britain or Sweden had not signed peace. The Fourth Coalition, and especially Prussia, was completely crushed. A few weeks after declaring war, the Prussians lost all hopes at the battles of Jena and Austerlitz, two simultaneous battles that were deadly on both sides, but decisive victories for Napoleon. Berlin fell, and Prussia was imposed very harsh peace conditions. It lost half its territory to a new state created by Napoleon called Westphalia. The quick and absolute defeat of 1806 remained an open wound for Prussia along the 19th century, and a major motivation to modernize its armies, expand and unify Germany. And indeed, the Prussians would take their revenge. In 1806 they were at a low point when Napoleon entered Berlin. In 1871, 65 years later, they proclaimed the German Empire near Paris after their victory in the Franco-Prussian War. With Prussia out of the way, the main opponent on the continent was now Russia. Russia had participated shortly in the Second Coalition, but withdrawn quickly, and in the Third Coalition it had just suffered a painful defeat at Austerlitz. But the country had large reserves of men. Its capital, St. Petersburg, and its largest city, Moscow, were not exposed to a quick invasion like Vienna or Berlin, and Tsar Alexander I was decided to stand against Napoleon. The French Emperor had now left Prussia to enter Poland, and once again withdraw frontiers. He created a Duchy of Warsaw, to be ruled by his latest ally, the King of Saxony in Germany. Saxony had dropped the allies and switched sides, seeing the complete collapse of Austria. Napoleon once again wanted a decisive battle, and he got one opportunity at the Battle of Eylau in February 1807. But it ended in a draw, and the Russians could retreat orderly. The second chance would be the right one. In June 1807, he could engage the Russian army at Friedland, north of Poland. With 60,000 troops, he routed much of the Russian army of 84,000. Alexander I was now forced to enter peace negotiations with Napoleon. The Fourth Coalition was also ended, now that Russia was about to withdraw from the war. And of the meeting between the two emperors in 1807, a surprising reversal of alliances was going to emerge. We still have 8 more years to explore before we reach the end of our story. But this is all for tonight, and this second part. In the third part, that will be available in a week or so, I will tell you about the zenith and the collapse of Napoleon. In the meantime, sleep well. Sweet dreams. Au revoir.